Good evening. My name's Jeffrey Herman, and I have the good fortune to be your Shakespeare professor this semester. I am a bit different than most of the professors that you have had thus far in college. You see, I'm an attorney and I practice law full time during the day. Um, so a bit of an explanation may be in order for how I got here and what I hope um, to help you accomplish this semester. A long time ago, over 40 years ago, I was in college at Columbia, and I had this amazing professor, Ted Taylor. And Professor Taylor taught Shakespeare and just won me over. Ever since then, I've been going to as many Shakespeare productions as I can. Um, Here in the United States, different parts of the United States, as well as in England, and reading a great deal about it, and kind of hoping, well, maybe someday I could teach. Um, when I went to law school, I was in law school at Columbia Law School, which meant that when I got bored, which I did, I cut law school classes, went across Amsterdam Avenue, and sat in other Shakespeare classes. Now, you are my first class as a professor, and I'm thrilled you've signed up. Um, and I certainly am going to need your help in figuring out how we teach this class, and it is something we all are going to do together. The thing is, it's my hope that my enthusiasm for Shakespeare is going to rub off on you, and I will have been a successful professor if years from now you are going on your own, because no one forced you to do it, you're going on your own to see productions of Shakespeare's plays, maybe even dragging your spouse or children uh, to those plays. As you go through college, you're going to take many different courses. And unfortunately, most of those courses you're going to forget pretty much as soon as you finish the course. You learn what you need to learn, you do well on the exam, you move on. There are only a handful of classes that really stick with you beyond college and into your lifetime. For me, that was Shakespeare, as well as art history. And my hope is the same will rub off on you. Now, you're seeing me tonight through this technology of, I guess, computer or videotape, because before I knew I was going to be teaching you, my wife and I had already made plans for vacation. So my wife and I are in Paris right now. And as you're viewing this, I'm probably sound asleep. It's something like 2 or 3 in the morning in Paris right now. But I look forward to seeing you in the flesh a week from now. So this is going to be a much shorter class than the usual one. I want to talk a little bit about the class and then a little bit about William Shakespeare himself. Next week, we'll start right in with our first play, A Midsummer Night's Dream. But first, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to do 6 different plays, and they really span the arch of Shakespeare's career, from early plays to really one of the last plays that he wrote. And when you put it all together, I think you'll agree by the end of the class, I hope you agree, that William Shakespeare was the greatest playwright of all time. And why is that? Well, the answer, I think, is because he dealt with issues that were very important to him, to his contemporaries, but are very important to all of us, and undoubtedly to our future generations. Shakespeare asks the big questions, and through this class, we're going to have to think about those questions. And you are going to have to look inside yourselves for some of the answers. And one of the things about Shakespeare is every time you read him, every time you see a new production of his plays, you see something a bit different. And you're also going to find that as you grow older, you're going to see the plays in a different light and gain different insights. Life has a way of doing that. So let's talk about the 6 plays that we're going to do together. We're going to start with A Midsummer Night's Dream. That's one of the early plays he wrote. It's a comedy. And it's about love and romance. And we're going to get into questions of how do people fall in love? How lasting is love? What does all this love stuff mean? The second play is going to be Julius Caesar. This is a political year, 2016. We're going to elect a new president. So it makes sense to read a political play. And Julius Caesar is a play about politics. It's a play about power and the nature of power. And it's also a play about change. And of course, unlike Midsummer Night's Dream, Julius Caesar is a tragedy in a different genre from the comedies that Shakespeare wrote early in his career. Then we're going to go to a history play, and we're going to do Richard III. Richard III is also about power, but it's also about evil, and it's evil in a historical context, and war, and the nature of war, and what that does to people. And one of the reasons we're doing Richard III is we have the good fortune to be able to see a production of Richard III right here in New Jersey at the New Jersey Shakespeare Festival. On November 4th, I will be treating you to a play. The Shakespeare Festival is in Madison, New Jersey. It's on the campus of Drew University. So arrange your life so that you can go that evening. Hopefully, I can take you all out to dinner first, if we can manage that. Then we'll go to the campus. There are a number of exhibits about the play on the campus. And then we will see that evening Richard III. The plays, of course, were intended to be seen and not so much read. So there's really no better way to enjoy Shakespeare and get a feel for all that we talk about in the classroom than to actually see professional actors putting on a play. So that's our third play. Comedy first, tragedy, then history. The fourth play is my personal favorite. Since I'm the professor, I can decide, which plays we want to do. And my favorite is Hamlet. Hamlet is in the middle of Shakespeare's career. It's an amazing play. It deals with many of the themes that we will have seen earlier. It deals with love. It deals with power, evil. But it also deals with theology and some very difficult questions. It is a mystery play in the most profound sense. And people for 400 years have been trying to puzzle out the mystery of Hamlet. It is a particularly striking play for young people, because Hamlet himself is a very young man who struggles with growing up, his father's untimely death, his mother's rather hasty marriage, and his relationship with a woman he loves, who he's not so sure loves him. So that's Hamlet. A tragedy. Following that, one more tragedy, one written later in Shakespeare's career, Macbeth. And Macbeth fits into all this because it is also a play about politics and power and evil. but it deals with another very difficult subject, the subject of time and the nature of time. So we're going to be looking at that and thinking about that. And like all of these other plays, there's some big unanswered questions we're going to try and deal with. Finally, the last full play Shakespeare wrote was The Tempest. He wrote it about 3 years before he died, and that will be our last play. The Tempest is a little different from all the other plays, and today we call it a romance. Not really a comedy, certainly not a tragedy or a history. It's a play about reconciliation. It's a play about growing older and separation. And it's a play about power and evil and trying to reconcile all of that. And how do you deal with that? And sort of make peace with the past. So that's The Tempest. And here we're also going to talk about some ideas Shakespeare raises about the fundamental nature of existence. What are we? But all of that for later. Somewhere along the line, I want to talk about the sonnets. We'll sneak that in. Some of the greatest love poetry ever written. And we could all use a little romance in our lives, so we'll talk about the sonnets. I'm not sure where, but we'll sneak it in somewhere. So that's what we're going to do. Okay, so what are the requirements? I know every student wants to know that. How do I get an A, right? And let me say about that, my first class, I have no idea quite how the grading will come out, but I talked to the head of the department, and I said, the last time I was in school, I was in law school, and in law school, there's a set curve. Only a certain percent of people can get A's in law school, and a certain percent B's, and then a large percent get C's, and it's a set curve. And I was told we don't have a curve here at Kean University. That's good. That means every single one of you can get an A. Work hard, do a good job, you can get an A. Great. Okay, so how do you do that? Well, part of it, and I think 15% of that grade is going to be class participation. Okay. Woody Allen, not quite as good a poet as Shakespeare, but a pretty good screenwriter, playwright in his own way. Woody Allen once said that 75% of life is just showing up. So show up in class, and you're on your way to earning part of that 15%. But I expect you not just to show up, but in every class, at least one time, speak up, give me an original thought, or help move the conversation forward. It's easy. You're going to find these plays really interesting. Things are going to pop into your head. And hopefully we're going to have some lively discussions. I'm hoping to learn from you, just as you learn from me. And that's really what's going on here. We're really a community of readers together trying to answer those tough questions. Then there's written work. I'm going to have 2 very short papers, about a page, maybe a page and a half. Easy, short things, be easy to do. You can be a little creative. 5% for each of those short papers. And it really won't be a burden. You won't have to do a whole lot of homework to prepare those papers. Then there will be a paper that will be due at the very end of the term, which will be a research paper. And I don't want a long paper here. 5 pages or so. But here I want you to take an idea and do a little research. That is, see what other people have said on whatever topic you choose, or you may agree or disagree with what it is they've said, but I do want you to do a little research and then give me a paper. Uh, Learning how to write well is important. Uh, as a lawyer, it's critical. And I must tell you that all the time I see written work from both lawyers and from judges that's really not that great. Um, and I think that's because they really didn't get the basic tools when they were back in college. So, to the extent I can help you write a little better, I will. And we're going to try to have wide open topics so you can pick something that interests you and will be fun to write about. Um, and the key is really showing me your interest in the topic. Okay, I don't. We're not going to do any quizzes, but there will be a short, and I do mean short, midterm, and then there will be a final, but it's not going to be that long a final. Um, Midterm 15%, final 35%, and that all adds up to 100%. Uh, and I think you're all going to do quite well in this class. Make the effort, show up, you're going to do well. Don't worry about your grades. Okay, so let me talk about a couple other practical things. I don't have really an office on campus. I'm an adjunct. I could see you before class and certainly after class. I can also see you at any time that's mutually convenient in my office. Now, uh, my office is in Saddlebrook, New Jersey, um, and I'm in a law firm up there, and we'll find the time anytime you can. If you want to see me for any length, and we can't do it before or after class. Um, you can call me, email me. I suggest you email me at my work address, which is jwh@njlawfirm.com. Now, hopefully in the room is one of the very fine professors here at Kane, Professor Bolton, and um, she has a syllabi, um, which contains all this practical information on it, and she's going to hand that out to you. Maybe already has, but if not, at the end of the tape, she'll hand it out to you, and it has all of that information. Um, and please contact me anytime you want. If you can't get me and it's important and you really need to speak to me, immediately, um, call my office and ask for my assistant, Barbara Blumberg. She always knows where I am. If I'm in court or meetings or something, she'll know that. She'll make sure I know that you need to talk to me, and we'll speak as soon as possible. Um, Hopefully, either this or the syllabus you're about to receive fills out all of the basic information. And when I see you next week, we'll try to answer any other practical questions you have. The textbook. Um, I have made arrangements for the bookstore to get the complete Pelican Shakespeare. It's a great book. It's one volume. It's the only book you have to buy for this class. It's not very expensive. Um, I think you can rent it for as little as $33 or something like that. Although I hope you buy one, a new one or a used one, doesn't really matter, because I'd like to think that you're going to take this book, which has all of the plays and all the sonnets, and put it somewhere in your home. And it will be in your home for years and years to come. And every now and then you'll pull it off the shelf, maybe read a little passage, perhaps read a whole play. Um, it's kind of neat to have Shakespeare there and have him as a friend. And you're going to find that he has a lot of good lines. things that you may put to use yourself in your life. Perhaps a toast at a wedding, or some celebration, or perhaps a funeral. Um, but in the course of your life, you may wind up quoting Shakespeare quite often. Anyway, get the book. You must bring the book to class, uh, every class, because we're going to be going over the plays through the book. I know the language in Shakespeare is a little off-putting at first. Don't worry, you'll get into it. The more you read, the easier it gets. And after a while, you won't quite notice the strange language. Now, there are always uh, things in plays that need a bit of an explanation. I'll give you some. But if you look in this Pelican, Shakespeare, you're going to see at the bottom annotations that will explain the meaning of some of the words and will help you with some of the more obscure analogies that Shakespeare makes. Uh, there are a lot of inside jokes, bawdy jokes, uh, political references that he makes, um, but they're lost over time, and that's why those annotations may be helpful, um, as will I hope. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. I'm going to take a little bit more of your time tonight to talk about William Shakespeare himself, um, because I think that's important, and it's a good thing to talk about in this introductory class. Now, let me start with the idea that William Shakespeare, the guy who was born in Stratford on Avon, didn't really write these plays, or didn't write all of these plays. You may have heard that sort of thing. And since there's so many, many, many books about Shakespeare, there's a lot of books about, somebody else wrote Shakespeare. Well, if nothing else, I want you to know that that is total and complete nonsense. William Shakespeare, the guy from Stratford, wrote all of these plays. Uh, we know that from a lot of evidence during his lifetime, as well as after his lifetime. And there was no one either in his lifetime, or 100 years after his lifetime, or even within the first 200 years of his life, that thought anything else. Everybody knew Shakespeare wrote these plays. And then, in the middle of the 19th century, some stuffy upper crust Englishmen started to say, well, how could a man who neither went to Cambridge nor Oxford possibly write these great plays? If you didn't go to a university, you couldn't possibly know all the things. You couldn't be smart enough to write the plays. And so they began all this stuff about people like Christopher Marlowe or other people who wrote the plays and used Shakespeare as some kind of pseudonym or shield for their real purposes. Total nonsense. Um, and there's a lot of upper crust nonsense that has been put out over the years. The fact of the matter is, Shakespeare never went to a university. He never traveled outside of England, but he had an amazing imagination. And it is that great blessing that allowed him and his gifts of poetry to write the plays. He was an extraordinary man. Lots of people go to great universities and they don't write very good plays. So who's the real Shakespeare? Well, he was born in Stratford-on-Avon, probably on April the 23rd, 1564. April 23rd, 1564, which happens to be St. George's Day. St. George is the patron saint of England, so that's quite convenient. It's also convenient to know that Shakespeare died on the same day as he was born, April the 23rd, but the year 1616. So he came full circle. The idea of coming full circle, the idea of what Shakespeare called the whirligig of time, shows up in a number of his plays. So it seems kind of interesting that he uh, should die on his birthday. Okay, well, who are his parents, you ask? His father was John Shakespeare. John began as a pretty poor farmer, but he came into the town of Stratford. Stratford, by the way, is about today, about a 2 hours drive from London. Okay, by car. I mean, it was a lot longer distance by carriage in those days, of course. But he came to Stratford, and in Stratford, he learned how to make things out of leather, and he became a glover. Glovers did many things, but among them, they made gloves, and gloves were a big fashion item in the 16th century. Eventually, he owned his own store. So he was quite a success in his lifetime, certainly a self-made man. He even at one point became the bailiff of Stratford. Now, Stratford had about 2,000 people in it, not a lot of people, certainly by modern standards, but it was a real town, unlike the little farm villages scattered about. So he became bailiff, and bailiff was a little bit like the mayor of the town. Uh, Eventually, something, we don't know what, happened. He fell out of favor. He lost his political office and his political influence. But we know that, he was a pretty successful man. He applied for but never did get a coat of arms. So he never became a gentleman, but he did all right for himself. Shakespeare's mother was Mary Arden. She also came from a family of farmers. She did, however, have some very rich relatives, the Ardens of Park Hill. They were real landed gentry. As far as we know, none of their wealth made it to Mary and her immediate family. But we do know from the records of the time that they were ardent Catholics. That was a very dangerous thing to be in Shakespeare's time, and we'll talk a fair amount about the religious conflicts of the day when we go through some of these plays. We don't really know a whole lot about the religious beliefs of John or Mary, but it's reasonable to believe that even after the Church of England was created and Catholicism was prohibited, that they may still have clung to what was called the old religion, Catholicism. Now, Shakespeare grew up really in what we can think of today as a middle-class family. And he grew up in this town that was very much a typical medieval town. You may have learned, and probably have learned, about the Renaissance. Well, the Renaissance had spread through Italy and France before Shakespeare was born, but not to England. The Stratford-on-Avon of Shakespeare's day, still in the Middle Ages. Shakespeare, however, was lucky to grow up in Stratford because Stratford had a grammar school. It was a very, very good grammar school. It was free to anyone, and it was taught by people who had graduated from Oxford University. So Shakespeare got a really good education. Now, in his day, education was different than in our day. 9 hours a day, almost all of it in Latin. Memorization, more memorization, reading a lot of the classical texts, a lot of drudgery. But Shakespeare learned poetry and literature and the classics from that. And he really had the foundation to write the plays that he eventually wrote. in many ways far more literate than most of us who graduate high school today. And it wasn't all drudgery in his life, because there were holidays and feast days, and every now and then troops of entertainers and even actors would come to Stratford. Um, Before Shakespeare was born, there were people who came to Stratford who put on what were known as morality plays. They were basically of a religious nature, but there would be some twists and turns to make them entertaining. By Shakespeare's time, there already were some professionals who came, professional actors. And we know that when Shakespeare was a boy, one of the leading troupes of professional actors came to town. We have no idea if Shakespeare actually went to any of their performances, but I'd like to think that he did. And the reason why I like to think it is the guy who was the leader of this troupe of actors was a man named James Burbage. James Burbage built the very first theater in London. He opened it when Shakespeare was 12 years old. And it was called the Theater. Why not? Okay, it was the first theater. They called it the Theater. James's son, Richard, became one of Shakespeare's closest friends. And in time, in London, Shakespeare and Richard Burbage were part of the same group of actors, known as the Lord Chamberlain's Men. They were owners in the troupe of actors. Eventually, Burbage and Shakespeare and a few others also were owners of the Globe Theatre, where many of Shakespeare's greatest plays were performed. Shakespeare's role in the troupe, we believe, was to act, but only minor parts. Most of it was to write the plays. Now, a little bit more on history of Shakespeare. When he's 18 years old, he gets married to Anne Hathaway. You've heard of her. She's the person who's in all those movies, right? Well, the original Anne Hathaway married Shakespeare when she was 26, 8 years older than Shakespeare. And only 7 months after they got married, their first child was born, Suzanne. Lots of speculation about all of that, but the fact of the matter is Shakespeare was a young married man, but of course everything happened sooner in life in those days because lifetimes were much shorter. So it wasn't unusual at all to get married relatively young, or to have children when you were young. 3 years later, Shakespeare is the proud father of twins, Judas and Hamnet, not Hamlet, but Hamnet. That's in 1585. Now, from 1585 to 1592, there's just a gap. It's what scholars call the missing years. Nobody really knows what Shakespeare was up to in those years. You can speculate, we would talk about it, but nobody really knows. What we do know is that in 1592, Shakespeare is in London, and he writes a play called Henry VI, which is a big success. It's a big box office success. We know that an established playwright of the time, a guy named Greene, wasn't happy with Shakespeare. He wrote some criticism that has made its way down to our own day, basically saying, what do these actors know about writing plays? Who's this Shakespeare guy anyway? Well, very few people ever heard of Greene. He's long lost. Henry VI was such a box office hit that, just like today, when you got a success, what do? You have a sequel. Yeah, like Star Trek 2 and 3. So, Shakespeare then wrote Henry VI Part 2, and then Henry VI Part 3, and after that, instead of just going on with numbers, the next sequel was Richard III. Now, Shakespeare's audience was really a very wide and mixed up audience. In the theaters, you had everyone. You had the rich, you had the merchants, for essentially what consisted of the middle class of that day, and those are the people who could afford seats. But you also had working people, people who didn't have much. They were called the groundlings because they stood on the ground near the stage. But having an audience like this meant that Shakespeare had to write plays, if he was going to make any money, that appealed to everyone. Appealed to the rich, appealed to the educated, appealed to the people who were illiterate. And I think part of the greatness of the plays is they do appeal across the board. Shakespeare also probably wrote, on occasion, plays that were intended to perform for royalty. Shakespeare became a favorite of Queen Elizabeth, and after she died, James I. In fact, Shakespeare's company became known as the King's Men after James came to power in 1603. Now, from all accounts that we have, Shakespeare was an extremely popular playwright in his day. He made probably pretty decent money from the acting company because his company charged admission, owned the theater, and probably did pretty well. Shakespeare did not make any money from publishing. In those days, it was very rare to make money by publishing. There really wasn't a copyright system in existence. During Shakespeare's lifetime, he never published anything. That doesn't mean that his plays didn't get printed up. They were. There were people who went to the plays and memorized the plays one way or the other. Perhaps they took notes. We don't really know. But unauthorized copies of the plays were printed by printers. And some of those, in fact, quite a few of those, have made it down to our own day. They are called quartos because they were on a quarter of a sheet. The printers took a sheet and folded it twice, so it's a quarter page, and hence the name quarto. The quartos have all kinds of things in them that may or may not have actually been Shakespeare's words or stage directions, and different quartos contradict other quartos. His sonnets were published in his lifetime in 1609, not by him, but by a publisher who got a hold of the sonnet somehow. Didn't have to pay Shakespeare anything for it, and he published it. Now, Shakespeare, as I said, dies in 1616. He writes The Tempest 3 years earlier, and probably, we don't really know for sure, but he probably retires to Stratford. We do know that he had enough money to buy one of the biggest houses in town. And we do know he was able to provide money to his children, Suzanne and Judith. Hamnet died as a child. So we know he did all right financially. 7 years after he died, in 1623, one of the great lucky things in history happened. Two of Shakespeare's friends, who had also been partners with him in the King's Men, got together the scripts. Now, these were the real scripts that Shakespeare wrote, and the actors used to memorize their lines. They got them together, they went to a publisher, and they published all of the plays. These were not published in the cheap quartos, they were published on a full page, and therefore that's called a folio, and the book is called the first folio. If it wasn't for that, many of the plays would never have been done, and because the quartos often had all kinds of mistakes, because people probably didn't hear things quite right, um, the folio is really a far better source of the plays. And most of the plays that you see are taken from the first folio. And that, of course, has survived to this day. In fact, after a Gutenberg Bible, which is really the first book that was ever printed, using movable type, the first folio is probably the most expensive and valuable book in the world. I want to just close and finish up tonight by saying that, and this is true of many great men and women, Shakespeare was lucky that he lived in just the right time. He lived in a time when there were theaters. Had he been born 50 years earlier, there literally were no theaters. He lived in a time when all kinds of people, working class people and rich people, all came to these performances, and they performed in big theaters, open theaters. We think about 2,500 people sat in the Globe. In the years that followed, the theaters were indoors, and they were, of course, much, much smaller, maybe 300-400. And people charged more money for those seats. And so a lot of the working class people, and maybe middle class people, could no longer afford to go to the theater. So Shakespeare came along at the right time for the right audience. He also came along at a time when theater was flourishing. Even though there was a lot of attempts at censorship, both Queen Elizabeth and James I loved theater, and they supported Shakespeare, and they supported theater. Within really only about 30 years of Shakespeare's death, things changed. The Puritans came to power, led by people like Oliver Cromwell. You may have read about them in history. They didn't like theater. They didn't like entertainment. They were very strict Protestants. Some of them came to America. We call them pilgrims. People think of the pilgrims as nice, jolly people who enjoyed having Thanksgiving. Well, they weren't very jolly people. And they certainly didn't like entertainment. So had Shakespeare been born 50 years later, there were no theaters. And he also was born at a time of stability in England. England had gone through a very, very long time of war, 100 years war with France, a civil war called the War of the Roses, within the time of, Shakespeare's great-grandparents and grandparents. But during the reign of Queen Elizabeth, it was a peaceful time, and the same for James I. Not that long after came the English Civil War. So again, Shakespeare was lucky to live at a time of peace, a time when theaters could be open and people had money and were able to enjoy this sort of thing. He also came along at an interesting time in the history of the English language. These days we think, well, English is universal. Everywhere you go, people speak English. As you know, I'm in Paris as you watch this. I can't speak French. I've been to Paris many times, never had a problem. Just about everybody in Paris and in most of France, for that matter, can speak English. Um, and that's true in a lot of countries all around the world. But in Shakespeare's day, English was only spoken in the British Isles. Only about 2 million people of that world spoke English. English had formed, so the basic structure and grammar of English existed, and there were lots and lots of words, old words from the Anglo-Saxon and new words from the Norman invasion. And they combined to form a very, very rich language, and English has more words in it than most languages. But it was still kind of loosey-goosey. Spellings were loosey-goosey. And Shakespeare helped form that language. And many of the expressions we use today were expressions and words Shakespeare first used. He invented a lot of words. We use a lot of them today, though we have no idea that Shakespeare invented those words. So he came along really at a formative time, an important time in the English language. So for all those reasons, Shakespeare came along at just the right time. And I want to leave you with the most basic of thoughts about all this. A very good friend of William Shakespeare was a guy named Ben Jonson, who himself was a playwright, and a well-regarded one. And he wrote, after Shakespeare's death, that William Shakespeare was not of an age, but for all time. And I truly believe that. And I think at the end of the semester, you'll agree with me. There's something truly universal about Shakespeare. Um, so that 400 years after he died, this of course is the 400th anniversary of his death, we're still enjoying his plays. We're having a class together to talk about what he wrote all those years ago. Think about that. Think about all the stuff you see on television and in the movies, the songs you hear, and how many of them do you think people will still be debating 400 years from now? So, with that, my thanks to Professor Bolton. My thanks for your patience listening to, probably too long a videotape. I very much look forward to seeing you a week from now. Good night, bonsoir, and let's have a great semester together. Thanks.